G'day everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Mia Oliveri. So today we're going to look at Australia's first serial killer, and it's going to be really interesting because we're going to look into his past and what circumstances and what trauma actually led him to do what he did. It's a very interesting story and I hope you'll enjoy it. So the man we're going to be talking about today had numerous names. We're going to go by the name William McDonald. However, as you'll see throughout the story, he does have numerous aliases and changes his name along the way, but we're going to stick with William McDonald. So as I said, he was born as Allen Ginsberg in Liverpool, England on June 17th, 1924. He was a middle child of three and he had a bit of wealth in his family as both of his parents came from wealthy Jewish backgrounds. Now the house they lived in, you could definitely call it a mansion. It was luxurious, had perfect gardens, had its own staff, nannies, beautiful paintings, furniture, all that you could ask for, except there was one thing missing, and that was love. Now William actually stated later on in life that he could get whatever he wanted as a child. Whatever request he had, he got. However, his parents pretty much didn't know he was there. He was brought up by his nanny and his parents labelled him as the idiot child and did not give him as much attention as the other two children. Now, William was a bit of a loner at school. Whilst other children would race home to do their homework, he would actually go to the movies after school with the 5 shillings that his mum would give him as pocket money, and he'd ask a random stranger if they'd pretend to be his parents so he was allowed to go into B-rated films. These films that he went into were true crime films. They were also horror movies with a lot of blood and gore, so he's exposed to this at a young age and he absolutely loved it. Now, his school life didn't improve. As I said, he was a bit of a loner. He'd go home after school and just read his true crime magazines, which he got into, especially Jack the Ripper. His parents took no notice until the principal actually came to the house and said, "Hey, your kid's having some problems at school." So this is when his mum took him to a well-known psychiatrist. And William would continue to see this psychiatrist twice a week for a year. And at the end of the year, the psychiatrist went to William's mother and told her that he was unable to fix William. He tried to get into William's deeper subconscious, however, William did not let him in. He said he was a very unusual boy and that she should send him somewhere else to get help. Now, the psychiatrist had also diagnosed him with schizophrenia and depression, and when he left the psychiatrist, his mum thought it would be better to put him back into kindergarten. And now this was a 14-year-old boy going back to kindergarten. So this didn't last long. He ended up taking a few jobs throughout his time, teenage years, and then he went on to enlist in the army. So in 1942, McDonald was enlisted into an infantry line in the British Army. They knew about his medical history, however, they still let him into the army. He said his family were very happy about him joining the army, however, it wasn't for good reasons. He believes it was because they just wanted to get rid of him and finally see them out of their way. Now, something absolutely horrific and tragic happened to William when he was in the army. One night, William actually got raped by his corporal officer, Alexander Rice. Now, Alexander Rice was 45 years old and he had done this to William in an air raid shelter. He was also William's superior officer and William had no idea what had just happened. He hadn't even started masturbating, let alone having sex. So he actually believes if this experience didn't happen to him, he would have gone on to live a relatively normal life. He thinks he would have married and actually had kids. And he believes he would have been a great father. And you just never know. If something like this didn't happen, I wonder if he would have committed these horrendous crimes. So he was later discharged from the army in 1947, and on his papers it said he was reliable, sober and honest. He continued to do a few jobs and a bit of study, and he still kept to himself. He liked to take extremely long walks, and now I'm talking 6-hour long walks through countryside and towns and things like that, and he continued to read his true crime magazines. Now, this is when William said the trouble started. He started to get really strong urges between 7 and 12 at night, and these urges were sexual urges, and he'd go down to public toilets and try and meet up with other men. But in doing so, he actually got caught by the police, and this was illegal back then. One night, a police car stopped him and said, "We know what you're up to, and if you continue to do it, you can get up to 20 years in jail." Now, he continued to do it. So the police went to his brother Jeffrey and said, can you do something about your brother? So what Jeffrey did is he took William and put him into a mental asylum in Scotland. Now, William said this was the worst 6 months of his life. 5 days a week he would go in for electroconvulsive therapy, which is absolutely traumatic and would be horrible for anyone to go through that. He wrote letters to his mother begging her to get him out of this hellhole, and after 6 months she did. She went there and told them that he actually wasn't insane. So what William ended up doing was packing up his bags, and with his last £60 he bought a ticket to Toronto, Canada. He went over there, however, tried getting several jobs with no luck and ended up becoming homeless. This is when the Salvation Army actually contacted his parents back home and said what William was doing. So he eventually got sent back home to his family. When he got home, he felt like he was back to square one. So what he decided to do was go get a nose job with the last remaining money of his army, and he actually changed his name. And this is when he changed his name from Allen Ginsberg to William McDonald. So with the new nose, the new name, he was feeling like a new person. With this new persona, William applied for immigrancy to Australia, in which he was accepted. This is when he flew to Queensland and got a job up there working in dams. However, he did not like the heat or the insects, as any pommy wouldn't when they go to Queensland. And he eventually moved down to South Australia. All was well until he was arrested on the 18th of April 1955 because he'd actually tried to touch up a detective in the public toilet, so he was charged with indecency assault on a human. He was in jail for 2 months. He'd lost his job, and they said you can go out on bail as long as you go get psychiatric help and go to like a mental asylum. And he agreed to this, however, he did not follow. Now, William decided to flee, and he moved several places. He moves a lot throughout his lifetime, and in one instance, he was living in Perth, and he was still riding back and forth to his mum back home. And she had actually told him that his father had passed away, and he said he'd felt no emotions, nothing. He just felt numbness. He then changed his name to Alan Edward Brennan and began working on the railways. He was only there for 2 years, and then he got fired for fighting with employees. He was always worried about someone talking about him behind his back, and I think this was part of the schizophrenia. He then moved to Tasmania, and the same thing happened again. Now, William was feeling like the whole world was against him at this point, and this is when the voices came back stronger than ever, telling him to kill. He then moved to several other places, including New Zealand. However, none of them worked out, and he ended up residing in Brisbane. Now, he kept to himself, still reading his true crime and horror magazines, still taking his really long walks, and as I said, going for his once a month meet up at the public toilets to see if he could get any sort of interaction. Now, these urges were getting really strong for William, and he went out and bought a pocket knife one day, and it was actually that night that he attacked someone in the public toilet. However, this man was lucky enough to get away, and William was waiting for like papers the next day to publish the story. However, there was nothing really there about the incident. And William was really upset. He still hadn't got this attention, this attention that he'd always wanted of his parents or someone throughout his life that he'd never received. And he'd even commit this heinous crime, and he still hadn't got that attention. William laid low for a little bit. It was until he met his first victim. This was on the 19th of March, 1960, and it was a 60-year-old man called Amos Hugheshurst. William met him at a railway station and could see he was in need of some food and some drink. So he offered him some food, gave him a drink, and said, hey, I've got 3 more beers in my backpack. Let's go back to your place and finish them off. So they were back at Amos's house, and they were just casually talking, drinking. Amos was drinking a lot more than William was drinking, and Amos eventually passed out. Now, this is when William got on top of him and started strangling him. And when he was strangling him, he had said that he saw his corporal, Alexander Rice. So he felt bad for Amos, but he just wanted to send his corporal to hell. So he just kept strangling and strangling until, unfortunately, Amos passed away. Now, what William did was put Amos in his bed and tucked him in. He thought maybe people will come in and think he's had a heart attack in his sleep. And this is what he did, left his body, and then went back home. Now, he laid low and kept an eye out for anything in the papers about Amos, and the only thing he found was his obituary. And this is when he called the funeral home and said, "What happened to my old mate Amos?" And the funeral home proceeded to tell him that Amos had actually fallen asleep and had a heart attack in his sleep. And this is when William knew he had gotten away with it again. Now he had felt invincible. So William went and bought a long-bladed sheath knife and went out and looking for another victim. Now he did find this old war veteran at the pub, and they went down to the park and continued to drink until the war veteran eventually passed out. And William got on top of him and held up the knife to kill him, and then the voices in his head stopped. So he got off this man and left him, and William said this was one of the lucky ones. This happened several times when the voices would tell him to kill, and once he got on top of his victim, they just would go away. In Sydney, he kept up the old routine. He was taking his long walks, reading his true crime magazines, and having his public meetups. Now, this lifestyle didn't last long until the voices came back and started him to kill again. So he went and bought a knife. And it was on June 4th, 1961, that two men actually went into the police station and had reported that there was someone murdered at the Sydney Domain Baths. They said they'd gone in there to seek shelter on a really rainy night, and they'd lit a match and found a dead man's mutilated body. When forensic investigators got to the scene, they were horrified in what they saw. This victim had been mutilated, and they had not seen that in Australia's sort of crime history. The victim was a man named Alfred Reginald Greenfield, and he was a 40-year-old man, and he committed petty crimes, but nothing serious. Now, he had actually been mutilated, his genitals had been cut off, and he had been stabbed numerous times. When one of the police had gone down to the water, because there was fish, like a lot of frenzied fish, and he shooed the fish away, and this when it actually discovered the man's severed penis and testicles in the water. So let's get back to William. He said that the voices in his head was so much stronger that night, and what he did was packed up a raincoat, 3 beers as bait to lure in his victims, and his knife. He then went down to the park and met Alfred there. This is when they started drinking together, and Alfred told him they should move away because they can get fined by the police for drinking in a public area. This is when Alfred led him down to the Domain Baths. So while Alf was sitting there drinking and smoking, William was recalling to his true crime magazines where was the best place to attack the victim, and he knew it was either straight for the heart or the neck. So this is what he did. He lunged at Alfred with the knife and got him straight through the neck. He hit him with such force that the knife went through one side of his neck and straight through the other. He then pulled the knife back out and proceeded to cut into Alfred's throat again, severing his jugular cord. He said he could feel the warm blood dripping down onto his hands and the gurgling sounds in Alfred's throat. How horrible. Ugh. Now, William had become angry that Alf still was not dead, so he proceeded to get the knife out again and stab him straight through the Adam's apple. He stabbed Alf numerous times, up to 47 times, and even stabbed him well after he knew Alfred was dead. Now, he knew this time when he saw his Alexander Rice corporal, he was not going to let him get away with it. And when he did see him in his victim, this is when he decided to sever the victim's genitals because he thought that now he won't be able to rape anyone again. And this is when he threw them into the water and left the scene with no clues and went back to his apartment. He said it took around half an hour. William's next victim was Ernest William Cobbin, who was a 47-year-old man and was killed on the 21st of November 1961. Now, the body was found in the public toilets in a semi-collapsed position on the toilet. He had been stabbed numerous times in the neck and in the chest. There were 50 stab wounds in total on the victim's coat. 33 of them had penetrated his skin. 3 of them had penetrated his left rib cage, entering the lung. Now, this man had died obviously from major hemorrhaging due to the stab wounds in his neck and in his chest. The man's genitals were removed, and from William's point of view, he said, once again, he saw his corporal Alexander Rice's face, and the voices in his head were taunting him to do them. Once he had removed the genitals, he wrapped them in a plastic bag along with the knife and his raincoat and went up to Circular Quay and actually threw them off the bridge. Now, William kept an eye out for media coverage regarding the cases. However, they were getting the details all wrong, and this was making him angry. However, he was getting a little bit of a thrill at work because his co-workers were talking about the murderer, and one of his friends actually related the murderer to Jack the Ripper, who was obviously William's idol, so he was stoked about that. And everyone had actually given this murderer a new name, and it was the Mutilator. So on the 31st of March 1962 in Darlinghurst, a man and his wife were pushing their baby in the pram when they'd stumbled across a man that had been viciously attacked. Now, this man was still alive, so what this man did was take his wife and his baby home and then call 000 and get the police down there. They figured out the man's name was Frank Gladstone McLean. Now, when the family had found Frank, he was laying 4.5 meters from the gutter. When the police had arrived, only 7 minutes later, he was only 1.8 meters from the gutter. This indicated to the police that the killer had actually gone back after the family had left and finished off his job. He overall had 49 stab wounds in his neck, chest and back. His neck had been cut twice and his jugular cord severed. Now, William recalled Frank, even though he was drunk, he gave up a really good fight for his life. And as William had said, even though he could hear the sounds of a crying baby, he was not going to stop until he got what he wanted. Once the family had left, he ran back, finished killing Frank, cut off his genitals, and then left the scene. And once again, he had thrown these genitals off a bridge in Circular Quay. Now, police were left at a dead end. They had no clues, no evidence, nothing in regards to this case. So they turned to the public and they offered today's equivalent of $250,000 to see if anyone could find out who this man was. Several months later, William had decided he didn't want to work for anyone anymore. He wanted to work for himself. So he ended up buying a business that actually had its house attached behind it. He opened his business for only several days and realized that he hated it and this was not for him at all. And this is when the voices came back very strong, telling him to lure someone in and bring them back to his house. So this is what he did. He travelled to Sydney by train. He met 37-year-old Patrick Joseph Hackett at the bar and lured him in with drinks and said, let's go back to my place. I've got more alcohol there, yada yada. So they hopped in a taxi and William made sure to not show his face to the taxi driver. He also got the taxi driver to drop them around the block from where he lived, so the taxi driver didn't know in what direction they were going. They got back to the place and William proceeded to give Patrick some more alcohol. Patrick eventually passed out and William said he just sat there with the knife looking at Patrick. And the more he looked at Patrick, the more he started to look like his corporal, Alexander Rice. And this is when he flew into a rage. So he went over and proceeded to start stabbing Patrick, pulled the knife out at one stage and stabbed himself in the hand by accident. And this flew him into a rage. Even William had said he did not know that he had this rage and anger inside of him. When he was finished, he washed his hands on a washcloth, and then proceeded to try cut off this man's genitals. However, the knife was so blunt that William only got halfway through and ended up passing out next to this dead man's body in a pool of blood. So the next day he woke up, he caught a taxi, got his hand fixed up. He came back home, moved the body into the other room and proceeded to clean up all the evidence. Now, he eventually took Patrick's body downstairs underneath the foundations of the house and just left him there. After he had gotten rid of the genitals off the bridge at Circular Quay, he returned home and realised he had made a crucial mistake. By removing the genitals, he had just linked himself in with all the other crimes. So what William did what he did best and he fled. He moved up to Brisbane, and by the time the neighbours reported a really horrible smell occurring, he was already in Brisbane doing the same thing, living his best life. So the last time the police came round to figure out what this smell was, this is when they discovered Patrick's decomposing body. Now, what had happened is no one had seen William, or as he was called, Alan Brennan, around for weeks, and What the police assumed is that Alan had actually committed suicide. There was no signs of foul play because his body was so decomposed. So they just went to his workplace to see if Alan was around. His workmates said no, and they presumed that he was dead. They told his workmates this, and the workmates decided to chuck in some money to get a wreath to put on his grave. And in the meantime, William had moved over to New Zealand, to several other places, but then he actually had the audacity to move back to Sydney. And when he was in Sydney, he caught up with one of his old workmates by accident. They just crossed paths, and the workmate was one of the people who contributed money to this wreath for his funeral. So obviously the workmate was questioning him, asking him what the hell is going on, but William just fled. So John, the man's name, John McCarthy, he ended up going down to the police and reporting it to the police, in which the police said, "We don't believe you." So with that, John McCarthy went to the media and told the media what had happened, and this story actually started to blow up a bit. So the police decided they better start looking into what actually happened, and they exhumed their body and did another autopsy on the body. Now, this shows the real shitty police work. When they had a look, they realized there was over 27 holes in the t-shirt that was lying next to the naked body. Isn't that suspicious as well? Anyways, one of the jackets that was there had a specialty tag from a tailor. So they went to this tailor, and the tailor said, "Yes, actually that was made here. A millionaire actually got these made up and then donated to them to a charity." So he gave the police the charity's name, and they went to the charity, and the charity identified that this jacket had actually belonged to a man called Patrick Joseph Hackett. They also got a fingerprint of the body, and they compared it to a fingerprint of Patrick Joseph Hackett's when he had a little bit of time spent in jail, and it was a match. So now there was like this massive hunt on for Alan Brennan, or as we know him, William. And by this stage, William had resided in Melbourne, and he'd gotten a job on the railway station. Now, two of William's co-workers looked at him, and they could have sworn it was similar to the lifelike sketch that had been published all over the newspapers in Australia trying to find this person. They went to the boss saying this, however their boss just shrugged them off and said, "Oh, you're talking nonsense." Nevertheless, the boys decided to go to the police anyway, and this is when the police kept 24-hour surveillance on William McDonald, and after one day they decided to arrest him. He immediately confessed to the murder of Patrick Joseph Hackett, and then he went on to tell the police that he was in fact the mutilator and had murdered the other 4 men. Now, the police had not linked in these 4 murdered men with Patrick because he was so decomposed that they did not know about his genitals. This was an absolute shock to the police that this meek and mild man could commit such horrendous and horrible crime. However, he confessed every single detail. He told them how he pictured his corporal Alexander Rice, and that's what led him to do these crimes. He told them how he did it, where he did it, how he lured these men, how he took advantage of lonely men that had no one to talk to, which is absolutely heartbreaking. It didn't take long at all until William was found guilty of the 4 murders. I'm not sure why he didn't get convicted of 5, but he definitely got convicted of 4. This is when he was imprisoned for life, and on his sheets it said most likely to offend again. Now, William was in jail for 52 years until 2015 when he complained of severe abdominal pain. They rushed him to hospital, however he did pass away. He had passed away from gastrointestinal obstruction. He was 90 years old and was actually the oldest and the longest serving inmate in New South Wales history. So even though he did what he did, he still lived a very long life. Alright guys, that's the end of the true crime. I really hope you liked this one. I found it interesting. There wasn't that much info on him out there, so I thought it would be a really good one to cover. If you liked it, please like, subscribe, leave comments below and tell me what you think. Really appreciate the feedback. Alright, bye!